Temporary duty assignments, TDY, can sometimes be fun and exciting, but this one was not. It was 30 days of almost round-the-clock hard work every year. The U.S. Army takes part in a rapid deployment exercise, where several units from across the Army are selected to take part and are airlifted with all their equipment to Germany. There, they engage in a month-long exercise. I was a relatively new captain in the U.S. Army working in the Operations Division stationed at Fort Hood, Texas. This deployment came at the worst possible time for me to be anywhere other than home with my wife, who was pregnant and due to deliver sometime during the deployment. Lydia and I had been married for 6 years ago. When the deployment began, my commanding officer said he'd do everything he could to get me home before the baby was born. He did, at the end of the exercise. I packed my things and was about to get on a plane. I called Lydia, who told me she thought she was going to be hospitalized in the next couple of days. The timing must be perfect. I was on my way home, so I told her it was getting dark. I was driving to the airport when a deer ran out into the road. My driver swerved to avoid it, and the next thing I knew, I woke up in a military hospital in Frankfurt. My right arm, right leg, 3 ribs on my side, and my right lung had collapsed. "How long have I been here?" I asked my nurse. 5 days. "Is my wife here?" I called Lydia. When she saw me, she asked if I was okay. She said she was fine, but she was upset. 2 weeks later, I was flown home on a medevac airplane. Lydia met me and traveled with me to the Fort Hood Hospital. She was still upset, but our time together seemed to help us both. I spent another 2 weeks in the hospital before I was discharged on limited duty. 2 years after we lost a child, we were transferred to Heidelberg, Germany. We spent 3 years there, traveling all over Europe. I was promoted to major after 3 years. We were then transferred to Fort Lewis, Washington. As a major, we were given field-grade officers' quarters, which were nicer than company-grade quarters and had garages. When we moved into the cabin in Lewis, we had to send back all the boxes we'd taken with us to Germany. We unpacked those boxes as well as the ones we'd stored and not taken with us, using a box cutter. I opened one of the many boxes and started taking things out of it. It was the box we'd stored things in while we were in Germany. About halfway down, I found a small wooden box that I didn't remember seeing it before. I put it on top of the stack of boxes and opened it. My life changed forever. There was a small stack of envelopes with a pink ribbon around them. I pulled the ribbon away and picked up the top envelope. It was an official document, labeled birth certificate. As I looked at the document, my mind began to fog up. It stated that the birth certificate said the baby girl was 7 pounds 6 ounces and 19 inches long. It also said she was born alive on the same date Lydia had told me our baby was not alive when born. The baby was named Hope and the mother's name was Lydia Jane Sadler K.N. Johnston. The father's name was listed as unknown. I picked up the next envelope and it was unsealed too. I pulled out a multi. It was an adoption certificate. I read it a few times. It said that a child named Hope, born to Lydia Sadler, had been given up for adoption and stripped of all parental rights. It also said that since the identity of the biological father is unknown, his permission is not required. How many men had she slept with in that time? Did she know she had to know that even in marriage, we need personal space and thoughts? I drove up to the golf course, parked the car, and headed to the 19th hole, where there was a bar and restaurant. I ordered 2 eggs over medium heat and corned beef hash, which used to be my favorite breakfast until Lydia changed my eating habits. I managed to eat most of it and sat on the deck while the golfers finished the 18th hole and went inside. When I got home it was the middle of the day. She had made a lot of progress in taking down boxes and organizing the house. I went to my unit and went into the office. There was no one there except the officer on duty. I sat down at my desk and tried to work. But I wasn't really in the mood when I got home. It was past midnight. She was lying in bed reading. I undressed and took a shower. "I'll sleep downstairs," I announced as I walked out and closed the door. I had just turned on the TV and was getting comfortable on the couch. When she walked in, she grabbed the remote, turned off the TV and stared at me. She said, "Cut the crap. Tell me what's wrong and I'll either help you or leave." I said, "I haven't done anything wrong, so I won't tolerate you yelling at me when I'm trying to help or having to get." I told her to back off and let me help. I took the remote from her hands and turned the TV back on. "Have a safe trip," I said. She left less than an hour later. On Monday morning, I talked to my commander and told him my story. I even showed him the documents. He was as surprised as I was. "What do you plan to do?" he asked me. "I'm not sure." "Did she say where she was going when she left?" "No, sir, but she didn't take all her things, especially the box." There was a pause before I spoke again. "I was thinking of trying. If I'm her dad, it'd be pretty tough to find her. I'd have to start somewhere. I don't trust her to tell me the truth." He said, "I understand, but you have to do something. You have to start somewhere." I literally jumped up. "Oh my God, I have an idea. Can I have the day off?" "Sure, I'll give you the day off." I saluted and ran out of his office and building into the parking lot. I jumped in my car and drove home. I opened the box. It was a wooden box. I dumped the contents on the floor. There was a pacifier in there. I put the box back together, put the pacifier in a clear plastic bag and sealed it. I got online and found a DNA lab in the area. There was one in downtown Seattle. I went into the bathroom, but all of Lydia's things were gone. I rummaged through the C cabinet under the sink and found her old hairbrush. I put it in another plastic bag along with the bag that held the pacifier and took it back. "Seattle, we'll give you a call in about 3 weeks." I didn't hear from Lydia for another whole day. "I think you should either liquidate me or divorce me." That's what I said, and I still stand by it. She said, "Me too." About what, she asked. We were still in the driveway. "You mean you don't need to explain anything?" I asked. "That's exactly what I'm talking about." "So there's no hope?" I said, "Let's focus on the word hope." "What do you mean there's no hope for us? What have I done?" It suddenly hit her. "Oh my God, no. Please, no. I'll be back in an hour. You'd better not be here. I'll leave for work in the morning at 6 o'clock. I'll be back at 5. By then, you should have moved out of the house." I left, came back exactly an hour later and she was gone, along with the box and some of her things. When I got home in the evening, the house was almost empty. She had picked out almost all the furniture and taken it away. She left my favorite chair and a bedroom set for guests. The next morning, I called my office to let them know I would be late. I then called Post Housing and arranged for government furniture to be brought to my apartment temporarily. I also called the credit union, our stockbroker and the insurance company. I also got in touch with the company and anyone else I could think of, and started doing all those boring housekeeping things that are usually associated with divorce. Then I made an appointment with a JAG Judge Advocate General Army lawyer. They weren't authorized to represent me in civilian court, but they could still give me advice. They confirmed what I'd suspected: she'd get half. We didn't own a house, but we had enough equity to buy one if we wanted to. Both our cars were paid off. My life continued for a couple more weeks. I went to work, did my chores, mowed the lawn and washed. One morning, the phone rang. "Hello?" I answered. "Is that Major Fred Sadler?" "Yes, this is Margie from the DNA Analysis Center. A few weeks ago, you gave us some samples to test." "Yes, I did." "Well, the results are in, and you can come in and look at them." "I'm sorry, but I can't. We can either mail them to the address you gave us or show them to you in person. We need to verify your identity over the phone, so we can't do that over the phone. We can mail the results because we asked you for ID when you were here. You were here, and we were able to verify your address. I'll be there as soon as I can." I walked through their door, introduced myself, and asked for Margie. She came out and we shook hands. She asked to see my identification and said, "Come with me please." I followed her into a small room. She asked me to wait and left. She came back a couple of minutes later and handed me the pacifier. Then she said, "Sample A is yours, sample B is from the hair you gave us, and sample C is from the pacifier." We figured out that samples B and C are definitely related, but sample A isn't connected to either B or C. "Thanks," I said, took the pacifier, put it in my pocket, took the papers and left. I got into my car. At least I didn't have a daughter calling some other man daddy, but someone else did. JAG wasn't authorized to recommend. I was looking for a specific law firm or attorney, but the JAG officer I spoke with was able to provide me with a list of approved attorneys and firms. The next day, I started calling them. I made 6 appointments. By the 3rd appointment, I found my man. He was a retired JAG officer and hated cheating spouses, both wife and husband. I spent over an hour telling him my story. When I got home, it was late. There was a letter in the mailbox. I got a letter from Lydia Fred. She said 3 weeks had passed and she wanted to talk. Her return address was her parents' place in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. I called her. She said she wouldn't talk on the phone and she wasn't flying to Pennsylvania, so I guess I'll have to come to Seattle. I sent her a letter last week when I was there. I'll be at her house at 6. I told her to come over, but she hung up. I didn't make any special arrangements, like drinks, cheese, or crackers. This was supposed to be a business meeting. I put the DNA documents and my copies of the birth certificate and adoption papers on the government-issued coffee table. She pulled up to the driveway at 6:20 but waited until exactly 6. I was in no hurry to answer the door. When she came in, I invited her to sit down and sat on the couch. She sat in the uncomfortable straight-back chair across from me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a pacifier and held it out to her. She grabbed it and held it to her bosom. She thanked me as if I'd given her $1 million. Then I handed her a copy of the DNA test results. She already knew I wasn't the father, but this would confirm it. She reached for the results and took them with her left hand, while still holding the pacifier in her right. "I take it you're sample A?" she asked. "Yes," I replied. I then pushed the rest of the papers towards her without saying anything. She leaned forward, read the title on the top sheet, and tears welled up in her eyes. She set the DNA test results aside and picked up the dissolution of marriage application. She started to read it, but the tears were already flowing freely and falling. She put the form aside and asked for a tissue. "I don't have any," I said. "You're making it difficult for me." "You cheated," she replied. "I did," I admitted. "How many times did it happen?" "Does it matter?" she asked. "No," I replied. "I just want to know. How many men were involved?" "One weekend, different men." "Who is he?" "Does it really matter? I think I deserve to know." "I'm not going to tell you." "Do I know him?" "No," I said. "I'm not going to tell you, so you'd rather protect him than try to save your marriage." I've filled in the divorce petition. Our marriage is over anyway, so why ruin it? "Okay, but you have to tell me why you lied about your daughter being stillborn when she was born." "When I found out I was pregnant, I wasn't sure if it was your baby or his. I thought about getting an abortion, but I couldn't. Over time, though, I was able to reason that you can't know for sure if it's your baby or not. When we found out it was going to be a girl, I was even more sure you wouldn't know because there is a special bond. I had a feeling you and my daughter would look alike as she grew up. I started to get nervous, thinking maybe you would find out she wasn't yours. Then you went away on a business trip and my nerves calmed down a bit. I was glad you wouldn't be around when she was born. Then you told me you were flying home and I started to get nervous again. My emotions have been on a roller coaster. Maybe you'll know, maybe you won't, maybe you'll be there when she was born, maybe you won't. I was nervous then she was there, alive and perfect. She was placed on my chest and I looked at her and fell in love. She was beautiful, with blonde hair and blue eyes. She paused just like her father. You have brown hair and brown eyes. No one in our families has blonde hair and blue eyes. I knew she wasn't yours, she was my daughter and you were my husband. I loved you both, but I knew I had to choose between you. I chose you. The hospital staff helped me when I told them I wanted to give her up for adoption within 24 hours. I had the papers in my hands. They asked who the baby's father was and I said I didn't know. They said it would be easier that way because if I knew who the father was, they would have to get his permission. I just held her in my arms. She was sucking on a pacifier when they brought me the papers to sign. I knew I had to tell you something, so I made up the lie that she was not alive when born. When you came home, I was surprised you didn't ask to see the birth certificate or anything else. I still can't believe it. I trusted you. I said I had no reason not to trust you, besides it was so traumatic that I saw no reason to add to our suffering by looking at those pieces of paper. Eventually, you and I got our lives back to normal. I was almost happy, but a part of me was missing. It still is, and it gets worse every year. On her birthday, I always made a point of pulling out her birth certificate, touching her little footprints and holding her pacifier. There were times when I wanted to put it in my mouth to feel closer to her, but it had some of my dried breast milk on it, and I wanted to preserve it, so I didn't. They must have scraped it off at the DNA lab. Oh my God, it's gone. She groaned, then looked at me. It's gone. Her milk is gone. You idiot. You took her milk. She fell to her knees and literally curled up in a ball. I picked her up and put her on the couch. I couldn't let her leave like that, so I covered her with a blanket and went to my bedroom, but not to bed. She stayed there for several hours. At midnight, I heard the toilet flush. I went downstairs and saw her sitting on the couch. Would you like some coffee? I drank more coffee. I asked, yes please. She replied, where are you staying? I said, brewing 2 more cups at the motel. You were there for more than 3 weeks. No, I was with my parents most of the time. Do they know the truth? No, I lied to them too. I told them that you and I were going through a difficult time and I needed to get away from you for a while. They paid for me to visit them. They think I came back to help sort out our difficulties. She looked around, walked over to she pulled a pen out of her purse, sat down, signed the divorce papers without reading them, and left. When I woke up, it was the middle of Sunday morning. I spent the rest of the day thinking. I took the divorce papers to my attorney on Monday, and he filed them. I've been thinking a lot about who Lydia cheated with. She never told me who he was or how the affair started. It wasn't just that she cheated and got pregnant that made me angry. It was that she defended the idiot. She wouldn't tell me who he was. The only thing she told me was that it only lasted 1 weekend. Fortunately, I was so busy at work that I didn't have time to think about anything else. 2 weeks later, I was back at Fort Hood, where Lydia and I were living when her daughter was born. Usually, military seminars are pretty intense, but this one was relaxed. We were divided into groups of 3 to work on a project. It turned out that there were 6 groups of 3, and there were 2 left. I got to know Keith Franklin, a major from Alaska, really well. We were in the same group and hit it off straight away. He was based at Fort Wright in Alaska, which is the coldest U.S. Army base, but he loved it. He was a computer genius and we were so far ahead of everyone else that we had to slow down and wait for them to catch up. On Friday of the first week we had lunch at the officers' club and he told me about his personal life. He had an affair with another woman and she divorced him. She is now living with that man and his 2 children. When I finished my story, he looked at me strangely and said he didn't know who the other man was. She didn't tell me and that was here in Hood. It was 5 years ago. She said he had blonde hair and blue eyes. We went to the Manpower Center. We were assigned to Fort Hood and had to go through it. We walked right into the HR director's office. She saw us, stood up and went around her desk to give Keith a hug. She looked to be about 60 years old and had a sparkle in her eyes. I liked her and I hadn't even talked to her yet. Aunt Lucy, this is Fred Sadler. Hello, Fred. Haired blue. She was looking at an officer who may have been here about 6 years ago. She thought for a few seconds, then said, "No, but I don't always see everyone who passes through here." "They all have to, but that doesn't mean I see them." She thought some more. "Fred Sadler, you were here around that time, weren't you?" "I remember that name." "Yes, my wife and I were here." I looked at Keith as if asking how she remembered that. Keith looked at me. "Aunt Lucy has Sam, and she can remember just about anything she's read, seen, or been involved with. That includes. She can remember everyone she's ever met." "Sam," I asked. "Is that a state of being or a curse?" Aunt Lucy interrupted. "It's a curse." Keith continued. "Very few people have it. Aunt Lucy is Fort Hood's institutional memory, especially when it comes to personnel matters." "Is that right?" "Aunt Lucy," I looked at her, then at Keith, then back at her. "You remember everything. Everything that happens to me personally." "Jesus," I said, "how do you have room for all this?" "We don't know. It's always there, so do you have any issues with it?" I asked. "Oh yes, I remember the good as well as the bad. It can cause depression if you dwell on it." "I can only imagine." I told her. "Aunt Lucy," Keith interrupted again. "Fred pointed at me and said he's looking for someone who was here at the same time. The only thing he knows about him is that he was blonde with blue eyes." She laughed. "That's it. No height, no weight, no rank, no assignment, not even his initials." "That's right," I said. "Calling me ma'am is a waste of good oxygen, Fred. I'm Aunt Lucy. Give me time to think and maybe ask around." "Does it matter?" Keith looked at me and I answered, "Yes, Aunt Lucy. It's important." He was about the same age as me when I was here. If that helps, he was in the Army, officer or. I suppose he was an officer if he was in the Army, so you don't even know if he was in the service. "No, I don't, or a civil servant. I'm sorry, I know it's not much to go on." She laughed. "Yeah, there's just nothing to go on. There can't be more than two. I've met a few guys like that in the last few years, but I'll see if I can narrow down the time frame." She took both of our phone numbers 2 days later and called Keith. "I've been thinking about the man you asked about. I don't remember any blonde-haired, blue-eyed guys like that. I've seen a few blonde-haired, blue-eyed soldiers, either officers or privates, who are about the right age. I also know 2 civilians who work for the Office of Postal Engineers. One has worked there for about 30 years, so he's probably too old. The other has been working there for about 10 years. He's in charge of new construction now, but he used to be the head of the plumbing department. His name is Kurt Weber. There are about 15 other blonde. I saw some blonde women on the post, but they didn't fit the age range. I didn't bother trying to remember civilians living off base because I assumed that when Major Sadler was here, he didn't have time to make many civilian friends. Keith told me, and I immediately started planning how to meet Weber, find out if he was the right man, and maybe get a little revenge. Personnel are the second lowest form of life on the planet. The lowest, of course, are those who prey on wives when the serviceman is overseas. These idiots deserve the worst fate imaginable. The next morning I was sitting on the next street over from Weber's house in my rental car. I was hoping he was golfing or doing some homemade crafts, so maybe he was on his way to the local hardware or lumber store. I'd been sitting there for almost 2 hours when I saw his car pull out of the garage and speed down the street. Thank God. I didn't feel like sitting there all day, but I was willing to do it if I had to. I followed him to Home Depot. We parked, and I followed him into the store. He was obviously known there because he talked to a few of the employees. There was a spot right in front of the door where there was a coffee machine. I knew enough about Home Depot to know that their regular contractor customers could treat themselves. Weber helped himself and stood sipping his drink while he chatted with one of the salesmen behind the counter. I watched Mr. Weber. I realized that he had physically engaged with my wife and made her. He was also chewing gum with his mouth open. I couldn't think of anything more disgusting. The clerk Weber was chatting with had to go help a customer, so Weber took one last sip of coffee, spat the gum into a paper cup and walked away, unwrapping another piece of gum. I walked over to the trash can, looked in it and saw right on top of it a paper coffee cup. I looked around but didn't see anyone, so I took the cup and got in the car. I called Keith and told him what I'd seen. He laughed and told me to hurry back, as he thought he might have something bigger by the time I got there. When I approached, he was literally jumping from place to place and waving some papers around. He said, "You're not going to believe this." He grabbed my arm and said, "Look at this. You'd better sit down." I did, and he sat down next to me and put the papers in front of me. There were a few names and an address, so I asked, "What's this?" "It's Hope's name, address, and her family's name. Her name is Sarah now, Sarah Randolph." I hacked into the files of an adoption agency. Those files are encrypted better than the nuclear missile launch codes. The President of the United States was involved, but he stopped and calmed down. I didn't hack their files myself. My brother did, but it's basically the same thing. I started to laugh. "That's great, Keith, but what exactly am I going to do with it?" "I have no idea. Maybe we can blackmail someone." "Oh, that's great. I can already see the headlines. 2 Army officers tried to blackmail a 6-year-old. Yuri was an old foster child. That's a great one." He tossed the papers on the coffee table and leaned back in his chair. "I see where you're going with this." He got a little flustered again, but we cracked their defenses, which is something. I laughed and carried the papers and coffee cup back to my office and placed them on the desk. I have no idea why I did it, but I looked up Hope's address and drove there early Sunday morning. It was almost 200 miles to Corsicana. The house was a typical suburban house. I sat outside for about an hour, observing American suburbia on a typical Sunday. I heard the noise of a few lawnmowers, the screams of children and the chatter of neighbors. There was no activity from Hope's house until almost noon. A car pulled up to the driveway. There were 3 people in the car when it pulled up to the driveway. A man was driving, a woman was in the front passenger seat and a child was in the right rear seat. The woman got out of the car, closed her door and reached for the right rear door. I was ready with my cell phone. The woman removed the child from the car seat and placed the child on the ground. She then knelt down to straighten the. I quickly took a few pictures of the baby's dress. I heard a noise next to my car and saw a woman and a child walking by. Sarah, the child next to my car, squeaked and ran towards W. I realized that the other child was Hope and ran towards her. They were only a few feet away from my car, so I took a few more quick pictures. I started my car and drove off before either of the 2. The women in the neighborhood were curious about the strange car and man parked on their street. I drove a short distance away and stopped to look at the pictures. For were absolutely perfect, I could even make out her blue eyes. I drove back to Fort Hood the following week. Keith and I finished the course with ease. We graduated on Friday and then had dinner and a few drinks together. On Saturday morning, I went to the airport and flew home. Keith went to Alaska and I went to Seattle. The following Monday was a school day, so I had the day off. I took Lydia and Hope Margie's DNA reports to the DNA testing center. She didn't remember me until I reminded her about the pacifier I gave her. I gave Lydia and Hope their DNA results and handed them a coffee cup with gum. I said, "See you in 3 weeks," as I left. It only took 2 this time. She gave me the results over the phone. It's a married couple, no doubt. She said mother, father, and child. She would send me the official results in the mail. I had all the information I needed, but what was it for? What was I going to do with it all? It just confirmed that Weber was in fact the guy Lydia had cheated with. I went to Walmart and got some paper and envelopes, and I also made copies of 2 photos of Hope from the DNA reports belonging to Weber, Lydia, and Hope. I cut off anything that could tell where the report came from and put it all in an envelope. I made sure I had gloves on from the moment I opened the bag of paper and the box of envelopes. I made copies of the photos and DNA reports, and I even used self-adhesive stamps. I used adhesive stamps in water, not saliva, to seal the envelope. I made every effort to keep it untraceable. I addressed it to Mrs. Kurtware at their home address. I also included Lydia's name and her parents' address because I had no idea where she was. Then I drove to Seattle's main post office. I went to the office and put the letter in the mailbox. I had no idea what would happen in Texas, home of Fort Hood and the Weber family, when the package arrived. The news from Keene was a little over a month old. I got a call from Aunt Lucy. She said, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want an honest answer." She said, "I'll do my best. Whatever you're doing isn't good enough. I need complete honesty. Is that what you and Keith did to Weber? I don't mean to sound smart, but what did we do to him? Set him up so his wife would file for divorce? Okay, here's what I did. Keith had I told her the truth, but I left out Keith's part. It seems like you really got under her skin. When his wife got your package, she didn't know if your DNA was his or someone else's. So, she did it herself. She took some of his DNA and sent it off for processing. She also sent the profiles of that woman and the baby. They matched, and that's where it all went wrong. Who was the woman he was flirting with? She was my wife, Aunt Lucy. I thought it might be something like that. Well, he was brought into the office yesterday, and he's not happy. He was ranting. I've just heard that his marriage is over, which is great news. I feel sorry for his family, though. It was over for me. Lydia and I were divorced, and Weber was on the road to divorce. I folded all the papers Keith had given me into a folder and put it in a box with other things I no longer needed but kept anyway. My life was moving on. Over the next few months, I went on a couple of dates, but nothing much happened. 2 years later, I returned to Fort Hood. I was surprised because I expected to be sent overseas like 90% of my classmates once in Hood. I found myself in Aunt Lucy's office. "How did you get back here?" she asked. "I have no idea," came a voice from the past. It was newly promoted Lieutenant Colonel LTC Keith Franklin. He walked into the office, closed the door, and we shook hands. I was really happy to see Keith again. We'd spoken a few times since we arrived at the seminar, but hadn't seen each other. I was glad to catch up with my friend after registering. I took a 2-week vacation. The first thing I did was look for a house. Lydia and I had been saving up to buy it. I assumed she would get half of it in the divorce, but since she didn't show up in court, I got everything. The branch manager walked by and introduced himself as Dwight Randolph. "We moved here about 6 months ago and settled in a brand new neighborhood. The houses are very nice and inexpensive. You get a lot of value for your money." He told me this, then went to his office and returned with a business card from the agent he'd used. I called her and found what I wanted in 3 days. I paid more than half the down payment and the bank financed the rest. I started working with Keith and I moved into my new house and bought a boff chair, a big TV and a lawnmower. It was my first night in the house and it was already dark. I didn't have any curtains or drapes and there weren't even enough sheets to cover the big front window. I had just opened a beer and was holding it. I was eating a slice of pepperoni pizza when the doorbell rang. I'd recently stopped eating red meat, but Lydia had kept me on it. I opened the door and saw a woman standing there. She said her name was Samantha Randolph, but everyone called her Sammy. We'd lived in the neighborhood for a while. "We just wanted to say hello, introduce ourselves and tell you that if you need anything, just ask. Is your wife here?" I smiled. "Fred Sadler, no wife, divorced." I saw her frown, "But don't worry, I don't throw loud wild parties or even soft wild parties." She smiled. Before she left, the first week in my new home flew by. On Saturday morning, 3 women rang the doorbell and brought food. They also brought decorating ideas that they had seen my empty house with the lights on at night as I sat in it with nothing but a chair, a TV, beer and pizza. They decided it was time to help me. The one who started it all was Sammy Randolph. A couple of hours later, I had a leather couch, a dining table and chairs, and a small coffee table to keep the pizza off the floor. The ladies were about to leave when 3 small children came running in, chasing each other. One of the ladies was Ruth. She picked up 2 of the kids and Sammy grabbed the third. "Hey, relax, Sarah," she said, kneeling next to the child and brushing her blonde hair away from her blue eyes. "This is our new neighbor, Major Sadler." "Hello," I said, leaning over and smiling at her. "I'm Sarah." She had blonde hair and blue eyes. I shook my head. "How old are you, Sarah?" "I'll be 7 soon." I stood up and we said our goodbyes. As soon as they left, I went to the room that was to be my den. I found the right box and opened it. I pulled out a folder with pictures in it. I hadn't seen this baby before. I made a note of the names of the father and lost her parents before, but now I did the adoption papers and named Dwight and Samantha Randolph as Hope's adoptive parents. Sammy and her friend decorated my house, and it took a few weeks. When it was done, we had a neighborhood open house. Sammy invited her sister and Joni Payne, who was divorced, happened to be there. I hadn't had female company for a while and Joni and I hit it off straight away. She was the last to leave the party and I couldn't wait to call her the next day. We met for lunch and had dinner with Dwight, Sammy and Sarah. Sarah was brief because she wanted to go play with her friends. Over the next few months, we saw each other as often as possible. The first night we spent together was great. We were sitting at the kitchen island when the doorbell rang. I threw on my robe and went to answer it. It was Sammy. "Good afternoon, Fred," she said as she walked inside. We were wondering who she was. She saw Joni and said, "Well, what do we have here?" She headed toward her sister. Joni was sitting on a stool eating a ham and cheese sandwich when Sammy approached her. She put the sandwich aside and turned to face her sister. Sammy's robe was open, so Joni reached up to close it. Joni laughed, but it was too late. He'd already seen everything. In fact, he'd never mind. Sammy said, "I left the room and went upstairs to get dressed. When I came back, they were still discussing my bedspread. When they saw that I was dressed, they fell silent." The following weekend, Dwight and Sammy asked Joni to look after Sarah while they went out to dinner. We were in the backyard watching Sarah in her sandbox without looking at Joni. I said, "She's a beautiful child, isn't she?" "Yes, she is." "Did you know she was adopted?" "Yes, they've had her since she was born." That's what the adoption agency told us. The mother was married but had an affair with a man she doesn't even remember and got pregnant. Her husband was in the military and she didn't want him to find out about her affair, so she gave Sarah up for adoption. Dwight and Sammy were to take her home. Sarah is the name her own mother gave her, but that name was Hope. It's on the birth certificate. I don't have the certificate, but Sammy and Dwight changed it. Sarah suits her better. I have no idea what happened to the birth mother and her husband. The adoption agency closes their files very tightly. They don't give the birth mother access to information about the adoptive family and vice versa. Sarah came over and wanted to sit on Joan's lap. She leaned her head against Joan's shoulder. She rested her head against Jan's and fell asleep almost immediately. A few minutes later, Joni asked me to take Sarah into the bedroom and put her to bed. It was my first time touching her, and I felt very uncomfortable. I gladly took her to bed. 7 months later, Joni moved in with me. A year after that, we were married. We had a very happy year until the Army got involved and we were told we were being sent to Germany for 3 years of service. We went to the States twice, once when her father and Dwight's father died and the other time for the reunion. Of course, we saw Dwight and Sammy both times. We saw Sarah at the funeral, but when we went back for the reunion, she was at camp after 3 years. I was ordered to go to Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I was going as a new LTC, assigned to the post headquarters as an executive officer under the post commander. This was normally a position for a colonel, not a junior lieutenant colonel, but I didn't mind. In the military world, you don't look a gift horse in the mouth to help me get settled in. The staff put together a series of briefings with the various departments that support the post. One of the briefings was to be given by a postal engineer rep. When I arrived, representatives from that department, as well as the postal engineer himself, were already in the conference room. I sat down in my seat at the table and watched as a blue civilian stood up to begin his speech. His hair was slightly blonde but with a touch of gray. He introduced himself as Kurt Weber. I just stared at him. He had been talking for an hour and I hadn't heard a word. My gaze never left his face. It was obvious that he was uncomfortable with me looking at him. At the end of his speech, he asked if I had any questions. "Tell me, Mr. Weber, have you ever been to Fort Hood?" "Yes, sir. I was in the engineering department." "Did you like it there?" "Yes, sir." "Why did you leave?" "It's rather personal, sir. I just like to know about the people I work with." I seem to recall a scandal at the Fort Hood engineering department a few years ago. "Do you know anything about that?" "Vaguely, sir." "Have you ever been to Fort Hood?" "Yes, I was in the engineering department." "Did you like it there?" "Yes, why did you leave?" "It's rather personal, so I'll withdraw the question. I just like to know about the people I work with." I seem to recall a scandal at the Fort Hood engineering department a few years ago. "Do you know anything about that?" "I vaguely recall something. I think there was someone cheating, if I remember correctly." "Thanks for the briefing. If you need anything at headquarters, feel free to contact me." I pointed to the name tag on my uniform. "My name is Sadler, Sadler Fred Sadler. I wouldn't want you to forget it." I was still looking straight into his eyes and I could see the light bulb turn on. And his eyes got really big. Kurt Weber went from red to pale gray. I got up and walked away. I found out that Mr. Kurt Weber had asked to be transferred. Unfortunately, this had to go through me. When I got it the next day, I wrote a big response. "I have plans that involve Mr. Weber's expertise will be key to making these plans a reality." The next day, to the surprise of almost everyone, Mr. Kurt Weber tendered his immediate resignation. I signed it every day. I also fell more and more in love with Joni. I watched her become increasingly beautiful and attractive every morning. I looked in the mirror and saw an aging middle. I was an older man, wondering what she saw in me. Whatever it was, I was grateful for it. We cherished our time together, and the years flew by much faster than I wanted. We were stationed in Alaska, and we traveled to Ken to visit Sammy and Dwight on our first evening. They told us about a decision they had made with Sarah, who was almost 18. She had always known she was adopted, and she was now interested in finding out more. Her biological parents, Dwight and Sammy, were on board with her decision, but the adoption agency wasn't helpful. They said they had to stick to the law. All we heard that first day was how outdated the laws were and how they needed reform, especially since it's important for an adopted child to know their birth parents' health status. They decided to use a website dedicated to DNA and ancestry. They sent Sarah's. They waited for the DNA test results. Sarah was hoping her biological mother would be able to attend her high school graduation, but with the ceremony only a couple of weeks away, they doubted it would happen that night. Joni and I were already in bed when she asked, "What are you going to do about it?" "What about her?" "Come on, Fred. Married couples don't have secrets or should not have any. I found your little 6 months after we got married. She can avoid DNA testing if you tell them everything you know." "Oh, I see. Oh, I see why you've been silent all these years." "I'm not sure. I guess I knew how sensitive you'd be about it. Dwight and Sammy didn't need to know, so I kept quiet, but now it's become important, and you have to address it. Do you have any suggestions on how I can do this?" "I suppose I should tell the story." "How do you think they'll take it?" "Well, Dwight is my brother and just like me, so he'll take it in his stride. Sammy is the dark horse. Okay, tomorrow we'll get Sarah out of the house and tell them she leaned over and kissed me gently." "Do I ever bore you?" she asked. "What a silly question," I said. "Of course you don't. Why did you even ask?" "Because you haven't touched me all day." I grinned. I reached for the buttons on her pajamas. I can fix that right now. The next morning was Sunday. Sarah was picked up by her best friend and they went to the mall. I gathered the four of us around the table, took a deep breath and began. I started by telling them that Joni and I had packed our things before we went downstairs, so we were ready if they wanted to kick us out. They looked at us, and Joni just shrugged. Sarah doesn't need to give DNA to find her biological parents. I know who they are. I could see from their faces that I needed to explain, so I told them the whole story. When I finished, I took a deep breath and looked around the table. Dwight just stared at me, while Sammy had tears in her eyes. After a few seconds, she stood up, walked over to me, took my hands, and pulled me in a hug. She gave me a hug and said, "Oh, poor guy, living with that all these years and not being able to talk about it. No one deserves that." She hugged me again. "Dwight," she asked her husband, "I'm trying to calculate the probability of how we all ended up together. I don't think there's a big enough number, so what do we do now? Wife and invite her to the prom since Sarah wants her there." Janie said, "Yeah, why me?" I protested because you started it. Dwight grinned, "But who's going to contact Weber?" "Not me," I said, and told him about the last time I saw him. "You never told me that." Joni said, "I didn't realize you knew the whole story." "Did I?" She leaned over and kissed me. I love this woman. When Sarah got back, Dwight and Sammy told her what had happened. She was both nervous and excited and wanted us to continue. The only way I knew to contact Lydia was through her parents if they were still alive, if they still lived in Mechanicsburg and if they still had a landline. I waited until Monday. I spoke to a private investigator in the morning and asked him to help me find Lydia's parents and Kurt Weber. It took him 2 hours to get the parents' phone number, and even longer to find Weber. I called Lydia's parents, reminded them who I was and told them I needed to talk to Lydia. I gave them my phone number to give to her, not an hour later. My phone rang. "Hello, this is Lydia Bowman. I was given this number." "Hi Lydia, Fred. How's it going?" I asked, trying to think of something clever to say, but I couldn't. "I'm doing great. How are you?" "Very well, Lydia. I need to talk to you about something very important." "Okay, go ahead." "Not over the phone. Tell me where we can meet, and let's talk in person. I haven't spoken to you in years, and now you're calling with something important that needs to be discussed in person." "I'm sorry, Fred, but I'm not convinced. I gave you a chance, but I'm not buying it." "Okay, but remember I gave you a chance." "What's the matter?" "Come on, Fred, what's the problem?" "I'll be there tomorrow. Let's meet in the lobby of the Bellagio Hotel. I'll call you when I land. We can decide where to meet the next day." "Hi Lydia, hi Fred. This is Roland Bowman." "Hi Roland." I turned my attention back to Lydia. "I need to see you alone for 10 seconds. You can say whatever you want in front of Roland. This is about the hope you had." She turned pale. "Can we still talk?" "Yes, he knows about her." "Okay, let's sit down." We found a quiet corner. I recommended wine. "I'll get it." I ordered a red, and I'll be right back with it. "Let's wait while we get some poured into our glasses. I'll pay for the wine, and we can all take a sip." "Her name is Sarah. She's graduating in 2 weeks, and she wants you to be there." Roland and I watched her faint with a glass of wine in her hand, and she didn't spill a drop. Roland took the glass, set it down, and patted her. I gave her a few moments to collect herself. When she came to, I repeated what I'd said. Then I pulled out Sarah's picture and showed it to Lydia. She started crying gently, touching the picture. "She's beautiful," she said. "Where did you get this?" "I took it yesterday in her living room." "You took it? Why?" I told her the whole story from beginning to end, including our failed. I tried to find Kurt Weber, but she didn't know I knew his name. She was shocked and then really angry. She asked why I didn't tell her and why I'd kept her from her for all these years. Her voice got louder and louder. Roland jumped up and said, "Calm down, calm down." He added, "You gave up all rights to her. Fred is breaking the law by doing this. Now, calm down." She calmed down when she realized there was no immediate need to see Lydia at her graduation. "If you want to come, I'll come with you. Can I see her sooner? You both need time to get used to it. Take your time. How about we get there the day before she leaves?" She smiled. "That would be wonderful. Now, how about I take a picture of you so she can see what you look like?" "Okay, we'll do it." I found a spot outside to pose when I started to leave. She rushed over, gave me a hug and a kiss on the face and head. She was pretty reserved, but she liked me. In fact, she liked Roland too. I decided I liked him too. That same afternoon, I flew back to prepare Sarah. I showed her a picture of Lydia. "She's beautiful." Sarah said she was very nervous but excited at the same time. It was the first time she'd hugged me since I'd known her. "Thank you, Uncle Fred," she said. "Now we know where you get your beauty," Sammy said, snuggling tightly against Sarah. "Do you know what my birth father looks like?" she asked timidly. The other 3 adults looked at me with widened eyes, waiting to see what I would say. I thought for a moment. "Before I spoke, I wanted to tell you that you got your blonde hair and blue eyes from him." The 3 adults breathed a sigh of relief. We'd only taken a week's vacation, so I had to go back to Alaska, but Joni stayed behind to help everyone prepare for the big day. I left for Alaska, promising to be back 2 days before graduation. I was due back in Ken. I got a call from a private detective. He'd managed to find out that Weber had taken a job as a consultant to the government of a Middle Eastern country, like several other American consultants. He'd disappeared shortly after arriving in the country and hadn't been seen since. When I met Lydia and Roland at the airport, I drove them straight to Sarah's house. When we got there, Sarah was standing in the middle of the living room. I let Lydia go first. They looked at each other for a long time, then Lydia spoke. "I brought you this," she said, pulling out a pacifier. "It belongs to you, and I thought you might want it back."